Single candle flame burning in a dark room. As I walk step by step through these deep and endless corridors of history, I will take you to the beginning of that long, brutal, yet fascinating conflict between England and France. This great showdown has a name, the 100 Years' War. But oh my friends, this is not just a war. This is a story that changed the destiny of two nations, a story etched in the face of history. It all started with powerful kings fighting for the throne. When the House of Capet ended in France, the throne was momentarily vacant, and in the eyes of King Edward III of England, it was an opportunity. He thought the throne was his right, but this was not just his battle. Behind him were angry knights, ambitious lords, and a populace steeped in deep resentment. I can already hear the sound of swords rising from the wide fields of England and France. But wait, were the events limited to the struggle for the throne? Of course not. There were other stories underlying the war. Trade routes, wealth, the balance of power, and the future of nations. All this sparked a feud that would last for decades. So I ask, was it worth such a battle for a throne? Or was it just another cruel trick of human ambition and fate? Now, I take you back in time and invite you to dive into that chaotic period. Let's start this great story together. Ah, my dear friends, this story takes us back to those complex and turbulent days of the 14th century. In the mists of time, the world was writhing in the throes of change. The mighty kingdoms of Europe were once again confronted by their lust for power and territory. And this time there were two major players on the stage, England and France. This was not just a clash of swords and arrows. Thrones, trade routes, and the fate of peoples would be shaped in the shadow of this conflict. It all started with the end of the Capet dynasty in France. Imagine a dynasty that ruled France for 300 years, putting its kings on the throne and reassuring its people. But in 1328, when the last Capet king, Charles IV, died, he left no heir. At that moment, the throne of France hung in a vacuum. Who would fill it? The French nobles put the king's cousin, Philippe VI of the House of Valois, on the throne. Across the English Channel, however, this decision did not sit well with King Edward II of England. Quote, Edward claimed the throne of France as his own. He was a Capet on his mother's side. His mother was Isabella, the sister of Charles IV. And so the young king began to see himself as the ruler not only of England but also of France. But this was not just a claim. In Edward's eyes, it was a struggle for the honor of his ancestors and the future of his own dynasty. Winning the French throne would be a victory that would change not only his fate, but also that of his country. But the issue of the throne alone did not spark this long and bloody war. Wool, the most valuable commodity in Europe at the time, was a source of wealth. England was the leader in wool production and needed the looms of Flanders to process this wool. Flanders was of vital importance for England in terms of commercial interests. However, Flanders' geographical location made it dependent on French control. King Philip VI of France tried to increase his dominance over Flanders and started an economic war with England. The people of Flanders, especially its merchants and artisans, were in favor of being allies of England because the French kings were restricting their free trade and threatening the economic opportunities offered by England. For this very reason, the rebel leaders of Flanders declared their allegiance to England. Edward had become not just a king, but a savior in the eyes of Flanders. This alliance not only gave Britain economic superiority, but also created a strong front against France. In 1337, Edward once again declared his claim to the throne of France and refused to recognize Philippe's reign. Thus began not only a struggle for the throne, but also a war for economic interests and national honor. The first steps of this war were taken on the seas and trade routes. But my friends, that was just the beginning. How would this struggle for the throne and commercial interests lead the two countries to war? Who would emerge victorious in the first battles? The answers to these questions will take us deep into the battlefields. Are you ready? Ah, my dear friends, this story takes us back to the summer of 1340, to the waves of the North Sea. At that time, the skies of Europe were darkened by the clash of great kingdoms, and the winds were blowing the sails of warships. The seas were no longer just the fishermen's livelihoods, but a gigantic theater of war that would decide the fate of kingdoms. And it was here that the mind-blowing victory of King Edward III of England was engraved in history, the Battle of Sluys. The 100 Years' War between England and France raged not only on land but also at sea. King Philippe VI of France had organized a large navy to take control of the English Channel and cut England's trade routes. Port cities became the departure points for French ships, and pirates who terrorized coastal towns joined this navy. Philippe knew that in order to besiege England, he had to dominate the seas. However, in Edward III's eyes, this was more than a threat, it was a challenge. Edward acted more like a strategist than a king. He knew that he could not protect his trade routes or land troops in the interior of France without destroying the strength of the French navy. So he gathered the best ships in England and recruited experienced sailors and warriors. Hundreds of sails moved at the call of the wind. England's navy sailed across the English Channel towards the coast of Flanders, and finally off the coast of Sluys, two huge fleets met. The Battle of Sluys was not only a show of strength, but also a clash of strategy and courage. The French fleet took up defensive positions in the harbor. The ships were tied together and prepared to meet the enemy like a wall. But Edward had devised a plan to defeat this tactic. The English ships rapidly approached the French line, and archers took up positions on the decks of the ships, unleashing a deadly rain. The French were terrified by the power of the English longbows. The wooden decks of the ships were a field of thorns from arrows. And then, like the thunder of the sky, British warriors leapt from ship to ship. The clash of steel armor and swords was like a battle march mingling with the waves of the sea. The French began to retreat in the face of this savage British attack. The ties between ships were broken, the fleet separated. The French fleet disintegrated in chaos under the British swords. All that remained was the smoke of burning ships and England's cries of victory. The results of the Battle of Sluys turned the naval phase of the 100 Years' War in England's favor. The French fleet had been almost completely destroyed. The English Channel was now under England's control. This victory was not only a naval superiority, but also a gateway for Edward's plans to invade France. England's merchants and sailors could continue on their way in safety. But the war was not over yet. How would this great victory force France to respond? What steps would Edward take in the wake of this victory? My dear friends, in the next chapters of this story, we will witness an even greater conflict in the shadow of throne fights and battlefields. Get ready, because this story is just beginning. End of chapter 13. Ah, my dear friends, listen to another tale that has been dusted with the dust of the battlefield. This time, As the calendars marked the year 1346, the seeds of a battle, nay, a turning point, were to be sown in the fertile soil of France. The Battle of Crécy was not just a victory or a defeat, but a storm that revolutionized the art of European warfare. And at the center of that storm, the deadly melody of English longbows echoed. After his naval victory at Sluys, Edward III set out with an even bigger plan. His aim was not only to gain supremacy on the seas, but to march into the heart of France and bolster his claim to the throne with steel. Edward crossed the English Channel and landed on the Normandy coast. His army was made up of well-trained soldiers, skilled archers, and knights renowned for their discipline. But what set this army apart, my dear friends, was England's deadly secret, the longbow. In the hands of an archer, the longbow was a work of art. 7 feet long and made of oak or yew, this weapon transformed a warrior into an angel of death. A strong arm was needed to draw the bow, but once it was drawn, the arrow shot out of the bow like a storm piercing through armor. Edward was confident in the strength of his army, and Crécy would not disappoint. King Philippe VI of France had assembled a huge army to repel England and defend his territory. This army was made up of magnificent knights and their European allies. The French knights, with their shields and heavy armor, stood like a wall on the battlefield. But, my friends, war is won not only by courage, but also by wisdom. When the two sides faced each other on the plain of Crécy, history witnessed a clash of reason and courage. Edward deployed his army carefully. Perched on a high hill, his troops awaited the enemy like a spreading half-moon. The archers were at the front of the line, the stars of the battle. The French did not notice this formation. Philippe led his knights, proud of their armor, straight into the English line. And at that moment, the melody of English longbows began. The archers stretched their bows and thousands of arrows soared into the sky. They rained down on the enemy like a shadow darkening the sun. The French knights were helpless under their armor. The power of the bows pierced the armor, knocked down the horses and shattered the ranks. The brave attacks of the knights were shattered by the disciplined shooting of the English archers. Each wave was crumbling like the last, and the French army was slowly being depleted. At the end of the day, the plain of Crécy was the scene of a tragedy of courage and pride. The French army had suffered a heavy defeat. Thousands of knights had lost their lives. Philippe's army was forced to retreat, while England tasted the sweet fruit of victory. This battle was not only an English victory, but also the beginning of a new era of European war technology. The era of heavy armor and majestic knights was coming to an end, and the era of longbows that brought death at a distance was beginning. But, dear friends, how long would England's triumphalism last after Crécy? How would this supremacy be tested by the French resistance? In the next episode, we will witness the Siege of Calais, a fierce struggle in which England tries to consolidate its dominance in France. Are you ready? Because the story does not end here. On the contrary, it is just beginning. My dear friends, after Crécy's arrows darkened the sky, the scene of the battle changed again, as the English, drunk with victory on French soil, plotted their next steps. They set their sights on Calais, a shining jewel on the shores of the North Sea. It was not just a city, it was the key that would open the door to France and strengthen England's dominance. And so, one hot summer in 1347, the winds of war began to blow on the walls of Calais. Edward III understood the strategic importance of Calais. The port city would be the perfect base for controlling the trade routes and providing easier access to French territory. But the strength of Calais came not only from its geographical location, but also from its well-fortified fortifications, surrounded by thick stone walls. The city had a strong defense, and food supplies were plentiful inside. But Edward knew that war is won not only with weapons, but also with the mind. That's why this time he wore patience instead of a sword. The British army deployed around the town to lay siege to Calais. This siege was very different from a traditional attack. Instead of attacking the fortifications directly, Edward chose to starve the city. The city was cut off from the outside world. Food and supplies were not allowed in. Days, weeks, even months passed. At first, the people of Calais tried to conserve their dwindling stocks. But time was cruel, and when supplies ran out, the city's strong walls were weakened by hunger. Ah, my friends, think about it. Inside, the people were starving, while outside the British army waited patiently. Who knows what stories were hidden behind those stone walls, where children cried and people looked at each other with suspicion. But Edward's plan was working. The French found that no force that came to their aid was strong enough to break the siege. After a year of desperation, Calais was forced to surrender. The surrender became not only a military victory, but also a symbol. In capturing the city, Edward emphasized one point in particular. Calais was to become a bastion of English rule in France. Its inhabitants were evacuated and replaced by English colonists. This meant not only capturing a city, but also establishing a permanent British presence. Calais became the center of Britain's war effort in France and remained Britain's gateway to Europe for almost 2 centuries. But my dear friends, the nature of war is that every victory brings a new challenge. The fall of Calais touched France's honor, and this defeat made the French even more ambitious. But meanwhile, in the shadow of England's great victory, a greater danger was quietly approaching. And what was this dark danger? How would this new enemy, so ruthless that men, French and English alike, could not even raise their swords against it, change the course of the war? Here, my friends, in the next chapter, we will meet the bleak story of the Black Death. Get ready, because even the mightiest soldiers of the war would be helpless in the face of this enemy. SM777. Ah, my friends, we have come to a time when an eerie silence has replaced the ringing of swords on the battlefields. After the capture of Calais, it seemed that a new front would open in the long and exhausting struggle between England and France. But who knew that the war would be shaped not only by soldiers and strategy, but also by an invisible enemy? Yes, the Black Death, one of the most terrifying nightmares in human history, would knock on the doors of Europe in 1347, bringing not only war to a halt, but life itself. It all started with merchant ships sailing the blue waters of the Mediterranean. These ships carried not only fabrics and spices, but also a deadly disease, the plague, the Black Death, a disease that spread from the steppes of Asia, and when it reached the ports of Europe on Genoese ships, it brought with it a horror to which mankind was not accustomed. Within weeks, cities and villages were emptied of people as the plague spread rapidly among them. Houses were abandoned, fields were left uncultivated, churches overflowed. But this fullness came not from those who prayed, but from those who were dying. And this fullness was one of the worst miracles in the world. All of it came from the mortal. Ah, my dear friends, even the losses on the battlefields were almost insignificant compared to this catastrophe. Both England and France suffered from this epidemic. Soldiers faced not the harshness of battle, but the cold breath of death. Armies that had swung swords at each other now stood on the same side, against an unseen enemy, the merciless grip of the plague. In addition to the soldiers, the people were also breaking. The peasants working in the fields, the merchants in the cities, even the nobles in the palaces of kings, could not escape this catastrophe. Neither nobility, nor wealth, nor faith could stand in the way of this enemy. The war came to an almost complete halt under the dark shadow of the Black Death. Britain and France could not find the strength to regroup their armies. War took a backseat as people looked for ways to survive. The plague had disrupted not only people's lives, but also the order of societies. In England and France, cities emptied and almost a third of the population was lost. This demographic catastrophe shook not only the warring parties, but the whole of Europe. More than the war, the rulers began to think about how to regroup their surviving populations. But my friends, when the horror of the Black Death was over, it would leave behind not only pain, but opportunity. Because even though the war had stopped for a time, neither England nor France were ready to lay down their arms completely. They would regroup their armies and come back stronger and more determined. But the wars of this new era would be shaped by the social and economic scars left by the Black Death. But how would this new world rising from the ashes of the Black Death change the war? In the wake of suffering and loss, what new strategies would Britain and France face in this struggle? Here it is, my friends. In the next installment, we will explore together the great transformation that reignited the war and shifted the stones. Are you ready? Because the story doesn't end here. On the contrary, it is just beginning. My friends, I will now tell you as if I had witnessed one of the most striking scenes in history. The year 1356, the scene of this fierce struggle between the English and the French, was the green plains around Poitiers, one of the fertile lands of France. However, the battle that took place here was of such great importance that it decided the fate not only of two armies, but also of two nations. When King John II of France gathered his army and set out to win a decisive victory over the English, the bitter scars of the Black Death still lingered in the heart of France. Its people were scarred, its economy weak, and its politics complicated. But the king had faith in his knights and their will to fight. Leading the English army was Prince Edward, aka the Black Prince, known for his genius in battle and the deadly effect of his longbow. When these two forces came face to face near Poitiers, the sparks of an event that would go down in the annals of history began to fly. If I could tell you about that quiet moment before the battle began. In the misty morning air, you could hear the gleam of shields, the heavy breathing of horses, and the impatient stamping of soldiers' feet. The French army outnumbered the English. The knights had turned the battlefield into a showground with their gold-embroidered armor. However, on the English side were the longbowmen, the hidden heroes of the battlefield. These bowmen, armed with experience and discipline, were a deadly threat, like the wind from afar. And then war broke out. As the French knights charged towards the English lines to defend the honor of their king, the sky suddenly darkened. It was the shadow of the arrows fired by the English longbowmen. Each arrow pierced a knight's armor, each fall of a soldier further shaking the morale of the French army. The numerical superiority of the French army melted away in the face of the strategic genius of the British. Towards the end of the battle, only a few loyal knights remained with King Jean II. When the battle was over, King Jean was captured by the enemy. Yes, a king was captured. He stood in his splendid armor and crown, a prisoner among his enemies. For the British, this victory not only meant winning a war, it also opened the door to a period that would plunge France into deep political chaos. France was plunged into a leadership vacuum with the captivity of its king. Within the country, a power struggle broke out among the nobility, while the people were crushed under the economic burden of this war. England, on the other hand, turned this victory into both a strategic and political advantage. As the victor of the war, Prince Edward not only gained territory, but also strengthened his hand at the negotiating table. But, my friends, this story does not end here. Can the captivity of a king crush the hope of a nation? Will France find a way out of this deep chaos? Or will the wind of England's triumph sweep across Western Europe? In the next chapter, we will seek the answers to these questions together. Are you ready? Because the footsteps of a great transformation are already being heard. Ah, my dear friends, it was now 1360, and Europe was breathing a sigh of relief, caught between centuries of war. The great defeat at Poitiers and the captivity of King Jean II of France had shaken France to its core. While the country was struggling with political chaos and economic woes, England's victories had strengthened the hand of King Edward III. But on both sides of the war, humanity was exhausted. The land was soaked in blood, and the people were in despair. It was against this backdrop that hope for peace finally began to blossom. Historians refer to this period as the Treaty of Bretigny, but I will tell you about it not only as a document, but as a result of desperation, a triumph of diplomacy, and a moment of silence in the din of war. At that time, the British were not drunk with victory, no. With victory came a battered army, depleted treasuries, and a weary people. King Edward III understood the need for a peace treaty to consolidate their victory. The French, on the other hand, hoped to buy time to regroup after a succession of defeats in the war and the humiliating situation of King John II in English captivity. At the point where these two different needs converged, the foundations of the Treaty of Bretigny were laid. The negotiations consisted of days and weeks of complex discussions. British demands were generous. They wanted to extend their claims over strategic territories such as Gascony, Calais, and Ponthieu, and to establish a British presence in France. They also demanded a heavy ransom for the release of the captive King Jean II. The French were very reluctant to accept these conditions. However, the chaos in the country and the captivity of the king left them with no other option. Nothing but starvation and exhaustion awaited the miserable people of France in those days. That is why the Treaty of Bretigny was signed on May 8, 1360, even though the terms were harsh. Oh, don't think this treaty is just a piece of paper. Every line was an echo of the blood spilled on the battlefields and the suffering of innocent peasants. The British expanded their territory in Gascony, consolidated their hold on Calais, and secured the release of the King of France in exchange for a huge ransom. This ransom was so large that the people of France had to pay heavy taxes for years. The peace had placed a new burden on the people. Nevertheless, the silence that followed the devastation of war gave people hope, if only for a while. But, my friends, it did not take a clairvoyant to know that this peace would not last long. Although the Treaty of Bretigny meant that France lost territory and accepted the supremacy of England, neither side took these terms to heart. The people of France were passionate about reclaiming their lost territories, while England planned to perpetuate these gains. And so, in the shadow of peace, the sparks of new conflicts began to burn. Now I must ask you this. Has this temporary peace really brought peace, or is it the harbinger of a new storm? Will France be able to regroup to regain its lost honor and territory? Or will England move one step closer to declaring its final victory in the 100 Years' War? To find out the answers to these questions, we must prepare for the next chapter, dear friends. History continues to flow like a river that never rests. My friends, I would like to take you back to the year 1358, when the land of France was shaken not only by external enemies, but also by the anger of its own people. The burden and pain of war were not only on the shoulders of the nobility. Indeed, the heaviest burden was felt in the deep silence of the villages, in the calloused hands of the farmers. Crushed by years of war and taxation, the people searched for a glimmer of hope or a shred of justice, but all they found was misery and despair. It was this despair that pushed them to break their chains, to challenge the order that had oppressed them for years. This went down in history as the Revolt of Jacques Bonhomme. As a new man, Jacques Bonhomme, my dear friends, was a derisive name for a peasant. The nobility used it as if it represented a quiet and docile peasant who accepted everything. That year, however, the name Jacques Bonhomme took on a completely different meaning. It represented the rebellion of an angry people, their resistance to oppression. The devastation of the 100 Years' War had left the peasants' fields empty, their crops plundered, and their already scarce resources completely depleted. On top of that, in the midst of this misery, the French nobility had imposed heavier taxes on the peasants to rebuild their armies and pay ransoms. So the patience of the people was exhausted, and these quiet and docile people decided to revolt. In May 1358, rebellion broke out. It was sparked by the French nobles' increasing oppression of the peasants. A wave of anger spread from village to village, turning into cries of revolt that broke the silence echoing across the fields. Peasants began to attack the noble estates, using scythes, axes, and even farm implements as weapons. These attacks were not just physical resistance, they were also a revolt against centuries of social and economic injustice. Estates were burned, nobles were killed, and peasants marched on, dreaming of the freedom they had long longed for. But this rebellion had no leader, my dear friends. It was disorganized, unplanned, and fueled entirely by anger. Although the nobles of France were at first baffled by this rebellion, they soon organized themselves. The nobles formed alliances among themselves, formed small armies of mercenaries, and marched against the peasants. Unfortunately, this rebellion did not last long. By June, the peasants had suffered a heavy defeat. Jacques Bonhomme's rebellion was crushed as quickly as it had begun. However, this suppression was not a triumph of the nobility, but a demonstration of the deep divisions in France. But my friends, the fact that this rebellion was crushed did not mean that everything was over. The spark lit by the peasants would continue to burn in the lower classes of France for centuries to come. The ghost of Jacques Bonhomme remained in the memory of all those who lived through the revolt and inspired future social movements. This rebellion showed what the people could do to make their voices heard, and signaled that the feudal order was being shaken. But, my friends, would France be able to recover from these internal turmoil? Or would these civil wars further weaken the country's resilience against external enemies? To find the answers to these questions, in the next chapter, we will take a trip down history's current together. Let's see which paths will shape the fate of France. Dear listeners, let us return again to the shaken lands of Europe. This time we will travel back to the time when war was reignited from the ashes, and the anger of two nations clashed once again. You may remember that after the Treaty of Bretigny, the battlefields were quiet for a while, but the war was never really over. It was only resting. The year 1369 marked the beginning of a period when this unrest gave way to bloody clashes. The new crowned king of France, Charles V, was known among his people as the Wise King. But his wisdom was not only for keeping the peace, dear friends. He was also fervent in his desire to restore his country's honor and reclaim its lost territories. The humiliating terms of Brittany were like a fresh wound in his mind. The vast territories that had fallen into the hands of England had darkened the spirit of the French people and deeply wounded national pride. That is why when King Charles took the throne, he knew that a new war was inevitable. Charles, however, chose to initiate the conflict with subtle diplomacy and strategic wisdom, not just sword power. Before being thrown directly into the battlefield, the French armies organized small resistance and uprisings in British-controlled areas. These guerrilla tactics, conducted by France under the table, it was weakening England's efforts to protect its borders and keeping its military leaders awake at night. Charles knew one thing: if we succeeded in winning back his people, the war would turn in our favor. A succession of uprisings and small victories on the battlefield dealt another blow to British control of the throne. Meanwhile, things were not going well in England. The heyday of Edward III was over and the government was unstable. Edward's son was now suffering from illness and had long since lost the strength to return to the battlefield. In the face of France's recovering power, it was only a matter of time before the English were looking back to the old days. Charles V did not hesitate to make the most of this opportunity. His strategy was simple: demolition and reconstruction. But this did not completely break the British resistance. As the war years came and went, this story set the stage for the birth of a new hero. A young king, King Henry V, would ascend to the throne of England. This man was the very soul of war. He was brave, decisive, and a leader with a burning desire to restore England to all its lost glory. The year 1415 hosted a moment that the pages of history will never forget. That year, a pitched battle was fought on the green plains of France, Agincourt. It was not just a battle, but a moment when English archers redefined the art of war. The French knights attacked with pride and heavy armor, confident in their superior numbers. But dear listeners, they forgot something. The English were prepared with their longbows, one of the deadliest weapons in history. Imagine that when the war began, these arrows painted the sky black and then rained down on the French soldiers. When the war was over, King Henry had won an absolute victory. The French army was decimated and the land was once again under the protection of England. But dear listeners, what was the price of this victory? Although King Henry's heartfelt desire was to restore English hegemony over Europe, France's national resistance was far from over. The fire of resistance of the French people only took deeper root with this defeat. You must be wondering what new challenges lie ahead for England after Agincourt and how France will emerge from its defeat. Be patient, dear listeners. The real climax of this story will come when a young girl rising from the ranks of the people decides her fate. Are you ready to discover together the unforgettable rise of Joan of Arc? Dear listeners, I will now take you back to one of the most complex and intriguing periods of the Middle Ages. The year is 1420, and the struggle for power in the heart of Europe is in all its glory and horror. Blood is being spilled on the battlefields. Kings and dukes are vying with each other at the diplomatic table to reshape the future. It is during this period that the rivalry between England and France is etched in history, not only in the struggle of armies but also in political games. Now, we will talk about a treaty that took shape in the midst of all this war and struggle. Treaty of Troyes. After his victory at Agincourt, King Henry V proved that he was not only a warrior, but also a statesman and strategist. His claim on France was backed not only by pitched battles, but also by long-term plans to take control of the throne. In France, the situation was complicated. The country was experiencing a deep crisis of governance as King Charles VI's mental health deteriorated. And popularly known as the Mad King, this monarch had lost his authority even within his own territory. Not only that, two great centers of power had emerged within France, Orléans and Burgundy. It was precisely this dichotomy that presented a great opportunity in Henry V's favor. For years, the Duchy of Burgundy had been an important center of power in the north of France. But an assassination attempt on the Duke of Burgundy's family had driven a sharp wall of hatred between him and the royal house of France. King Henry V would once again show how adept he was at turning this enmity to his advantage. The alliance between England and Burgundy was an important step towards shattering the already fractured unity of France. This unity gave Britain a unique advantage in the political game. This treaty, concluded in Troyes in 1420, was truly a product of Henry's power and determination. According to the treaty, the Mad King Charles VI would officially make King Henry V of England his son-in-law, and promised that upon his death, the throne of France would pass to Henry. Isn't this a fascinating story, dear listeners? Imagine, with one signature, not only is he promised to be the King of France, but he is also set to become a monarch uniting two great European kingdoms. Henry knew very well that he had to win not only military but also diplomatic victories to ascend to the French throne. But this was not only a victory for Henry. The Duke of Burgundy was also extremely pleased with this agreement. The English had now become the strongest ally their duchy could count on. This alliance with Burgundy further fragmented the French resistance. The French people, on the other hand, saw it as a great betrayal. The fact that they had to come under British rule because of their own internal strife led them to even greater anger and future rebellions. Unfortunately, dear listeners, we know that King Henry V did not enjoy these political and military successes for long. He would die young, before the throne promised by the Treaty of Troyes was fully in his hands. But the fate of France was still not completely sealed. When we come to the next chapter, I will tell the story of the inspiration that would rise from among her people to lead France out of darkness and the rebirth of the national spirit. Are you ready to meet the story of a young woman who galvanized the French people? The name of the legend? Joan of Arc. Ah, my friends, welcome to one of the most fascinating stops on your journey into the stories that swords and faith write together. Today I will tell you the story of a young girl who changed the destiny of an entire nation with a divine faith in her heart. You may have heard her name many times, Joan of Arc. But know that her story is not just about victory in battlefields. It is also an epic of faith, perseverance, and courage. It all started with an extraordinary journey that began in an ordinary village. In 1429, France was on the brink of destruction. English supremacy was strangling the country, while the betrayals of the Duchy of Burgundy had crushed the hopes of the French people like a broken bow. Even King Charles VII had begun to doubt his right to the throne. It was at this time that a peasant girl emerged, who claimed to have surrendered to the will of God. Living in the impoverished village of Domremy, Jeanne believed that France would rise again with visions she received from God. These visions, which she said came from St. Michael, St. Catherine, and St. Marguerite, gave her a clear mission: to save the French nation and crown King Charles. For a little girl to shoulder such a huge challenge was a ray of hope amidst the suffering of the people. Jeanne first tried to convince the local nobility. Her determination and conviction, though initially met with skepticism, soon captivated everyone around her. Even those who did not know her believed that she carried a different light. In a period of darkness in France, this flood of faith from his heart led him to appear before King Charles VII. Ah, dear friends, think of that scene: a humble peasant girl standing tall among kings and lords, saying, "I come by the will of God." In the words of this young girl and in the fire in her eyes, King Charles found a confidence that perhaps he had never felt before, at a time when his own throne was shaking. He listened to his messages, believed in his existence, and did not silence this divine voice that would lift the morale of the people. And then history witnessed one of those magical moments when fate changed course. Under Jeanne's leadership, the French city of Orléans was dying under siege. The British were determined to capture this strategic point, and the morale of the French army was at rock bottom. But when Jeanne donned her warrior's armor and led the army with a white flag, she proved to be more than just a leader. Not only the soldiers believed in her, but also the soul-stricken French people. As the battle cries echoed through the stone streets of Orléans, led by Jeanne, they felt God accompanying them at every stroke. Jeanne not only instilled courage in the soldiers, but also disciplined them. With leadership from the depths of her soul, she raised the moral strength of the army. Her plans to liberate besieged Orléans and her courage made this hitherto ignored young girl a national heroine. The year 1429 is remembered as the year the fate of France was rewritten, and the English retreated in shock and defeat. The liberation of Orléans was not just the end of a siege of a city, it heralded a divine miracle for France. But ah, dear friends, where would Jeanne's path lead after the victory? Everyone who met her now recognized that this young woman was no simple peasant. But what more awaited this courageous leader who had shaken her enemies? The faith in Jeanne's heart didn't just shine on the battlefields. It illuminated even the darkest corners of the nation. Would that light be able to dispel all the darkness of France? In the next episode, we will look for the answer to this question. Are you ready to pick up where you left off? Ah, my friends, welcome to the days when a young woman chosen by fate to be her messenger and her divine faith raised an entire nation to its feet. Today I will take you to the heart of France, to Reims, to tell you about the hope of a war-weary nation, the triumph of courage over fear, and the moment when the legitimacy of a king was restored in the hearts of the people. It was a moment when it seemed as if the whole world was holding its breath, watching this epic march. When Joan of Arc lifted the siege of Orléans and brought the enemy to its knees, she had not only changed the course of a war, she had blazed a new path that would shape the destiny of France. But the meaning of this victory would not be complete without the holy march to Reims. Ah, the coronation of King Charles VII was essential to raise the morale of a nation and crown its success on the battlefields. Unfortunately, There is a little to unravel about that story, higher than the meaning of that word. Reims was the city where French kings had been consecrated for centuries, where they received their legitimacy from God. A ceremony there would not only consolidate the kingship of France, but also reignite the spirit of the people. But there was a difficult road to reach this sacred goal. The enemies, the British and the Burgundians who collaborated with them, were ready to do anything to prevent this march. Joan of Arc was not only a soldier but also a visionary. Inspired by God, she told everyone about the importance of this march and galvanized those around her with her determination. The French army, though buoyed by the victory at Orléans, was still surrounded by enemy superiority. But Jeanne's determination to overcome these difficulties and breaking through the holy city was like a river, breaking through the obstacles in its path. Once the preparations were complete, Charles VII and his army set out for Reims, led by Jeanne. The cities that were expected to block the road were hesitant to resist Jeanne's rising fame, and the people took to the streets to see this miraculous woman. The narrow country lanes, crowded with soldiers, echoed with the prayers and cheers of the people. Among those who believed Jeanne to be a divine leader, there was hardly anyone left who doubted her sanctity. Finally, the French army arrived in front of the walls of Reims. There were fears of an attack by the English or Burgundians, but the people of Reims opened the city gates wide and embraced their king and Jeanne. Ah, dear friends, you should have seen the scene. The king gliding through the crowd and a young girl in armor walking beside him. Jeanne was not just a soldier that day, but a soldier defending the legitimacy of her king before God. The coronation took place in the cathedral with great pomp. It was a rebirth for the French people after years of despair and fragmentation. The crown placed on the head of Charles VII was not just the enthronement of a monarch, but a symbol of the nation's spirit of unity. Jeanne remained humble, even as she knelt at the ceremony and said, "My mission is accomplished. God has done his will." But everyone knew that this crown had been made possible by Jeanne's faith. France felt the power of being able to rule on its own soil again. But my friends, life is not all about victory. Could the hope that had risen in Reims continue to shine as brightly on the battlefields? Did the great change that Jeanne inspired have the power to end the struggle with the English? In the next chapter, let's turn another page in France's story of struggle and find the answer together. Ah, my dear friends, the saga of Joan of Arc, whose heroic deeds spread from tongue to tongue and who was seen as a soldier of God, has perhaps reached one of the most painful twists of fate. Let us remember together the fall of this young woman, the hope and symbol of the French people, and her fall into the net of injustice masquerading as justice. As she recounts those days, one feels a pang of sadness, as Jeanne's courage and loyalty were sadly overshadowed by betrayal and political games. The year was 1430. Jeanne thought she had fulfilled her sacred duty to resurrect France by crowning Charles VII. But for a war-weary nation, the struggle was far from over. Armed with her faith and courage like a sword, Jeanne led the French army to victory in Burgundy. In a battle near Compiègne, she met the heavy hand of fate. Burgundian soldiers managed to capture Jeanne, and this meant not only the capture of a young woman, but the temporary extinguishing of the light of hope for France. Ah, friends, you cannot imagine what this capture meant. Jeanne's captivity was not just a prisoner of war. The Burgundians knew very well what a prize she was to the English. They quickly handed her over to the English. And so Jeanne's fate became a part of political games accusations of heresy and betrayal, even by her own nation. The British saw Jeanne not only as a prisoner, but as a symbol of resistance in the heart of the French people. They thought that if Jeanne could be silenced, it would be possible to put out the fire in France. When Jeanne was taken to Rouen, it was as if she had been put on a theater stage. She was put on trial on charges of heresy. Ah, dear friends, one did not need to be a philosopher to know that those trials were a farce. The court was presided over by a clergy under the influence of the English, and Jeanne's fate seemed predetermined. The questions she was asked were merely traps waiting for her to stumble. Jeanne answered as best she could, tried to resist. Standing by her belief, she continued to describe the visions she had received from God. But no matter how much she proved her innocence, the English went to great lengths to portray Jeanne in the public eye as a heretic, even a witch. And that fateful day, on the morning of May 30, 1431, in the square of Rouen, Jeanne was delivered into the merciless arms of fire. Unafraid to die for her faith, this young woman ascended in flames, representing not only a physical body, but a national spirit. Legends tell us that Jeanne's heart remained like an ember, even in the midst of the flames, and that the people once again witnessed her holiness at that moment. That execution didn't just kill one man, dear friends. It inflamed the hearts of the French people and fueled their anger against the English. After Jeanne's death, prayers were said all over France in her memory. People began to remember Jeanne not as a soldier, but as a martyr, a saint. Jeanne's sacrifice reaffirmed France's faith in freedom and unity. So, my friends, can one woman's courage, faith, and sacrifice be strong enough to save a nation? And how did Jeanne's epic of martyrdom change the fate of France? In the next episode, let's discover together how France keeps Jeanne's spirit alive on the battlefields. Ah, dear friends, if you follow human history so carefully, you will realize that every great rise is followed by a decline. In the early years of the 100 Years' War, England advanced rapidly, and it looked as if she was going to swallow France's territory one by one. But no power can forever turn the great wheel of history in its favor. When those days came, France's fortunes began to turn. For England, the war had become a burden rather than a struggle for victory. These final stages were pregnant with events that would radically change the history of the two nations. The year 1435. France may seem to have fallen after the martyrdom of Joan of Arc, but oh, what a mistake. The French nation was rising from the ashes. Charles VII was no longer just a name as king, but a leader who used his power more wisely. One of the biggest changes in the fate of France in this period was the Great Alliance with Burgundy. Until then, the Duchy of Burgundy had acted like a dagger, deepening France's wounds by siding with England. However, this story changed with the Treaty of Arras in 1435. The Duke of Burgundy chose to make peace with France, weakening England's arms and strengthening France's shields. This alliance marked the beginning of a fundamental change on French soil. The British now had not only France against them, but also a powerful ally supporting them. In a chain of interconnected events, the Treaty of Arras was only the beginning. The French army, strengthened by the support of Burgundy, regrouped with a fury that seemed to have seeped into them. One by one, France began to reclaim its lost territories. Charles VII laid the foundation for victory, not only on the battlefield, but also by reshaping the political structure of his kingdom. Backed by the support of the local population, he distributed the financial burden of the war more evenly, and thus equipped his armies with greater strength. The morale of the French soldiers soared. It was as if the spirit of Joan of Arc continued to give them courage. On the other hand, England's star was beginning to fade. The long war had drained the English treasury and the people were war-weary. Henry VI's weak leadership and internal political strife made England's struggle in France more and more difficult. England was no longer a power trying to conquer France, but an occupier trying to protect its remaining territories. However, in the face of France's determined resistance, even these efforts proved insufficient. One of the most memorable moments of this process were the French victories along the Loire Valley. These small victories in the 1440s broke England's resistance piece by piece. As if playing a game of chess, Charles VII and his loyal commanders approached Paris, eroding the English defenses. The war was slowly coming to an end, but it was going to be a tough finale for both France and Britain. Battle of Castillon in 1453. When Bordeaux, England's last military foothold in France, fell under French control, history was rewritten. The end of England's rule in France and the end of the 100 Years' War marked the beginning of a new era. But my friends, after such a long and bloody struggle, both nations would be left with new challenges and opportunities. But how would the history of France and England be shaped in a period when the wars lasted so long and the hopes of the peoples were so tested? Would England be content to swallow its defeat? Or would it emerge on the stage of history with a new plan? In the next chapter, let's take a look at the world shaped after this great war. My dear friends, we are approaching the end of a great era. From the moment it began, the 100 Years' War has been etched in the heart of Europe, shaping nations for generations and profoundly influencing the destiny of humanity. But as all things come to an end, this long and bloody struggle was destined to reach its conclusion. Today, I will tell you about the fall of Bordeaux and the closing scene of this titanic battle. I see before my eyes the memories of those days when swords clashed and fires soared to the skies as if they happened yesterday. By 1453, France had completely seized the momentum and turned the tide of the war in its favor. The legacy of Joan of Arc was still alive in the souls of the people, and the French armies were confident as they fought this final battle for their kingdom. England now had very little territory left to hold in France, Bordeaux being the most important of these. The city that had long been a vital economic and strategic outlet for England was now surrounded by the enemy. The city's defenses were strong, and the British believed they would make their last stand here. But France's determination swept through like a storm. To the last officer, except for Mr. George Harve, the old French soldier heading the Royal Academy to New York, went away bleeding. The French army's approach to Bordeaux was not a battle, but a masterpiece of engineering and strategy. Charles VII wanted to make this victory a final close. As artillery and troops were mobilized, the siege plan was carefully drawn up. A tight ring was set up around Bordeaux, so that the English inside had no choice but to wait for help. Support from England was now only a dream. Under Henry VI's leadership, England was plagued by domestic conflicts and economic difficulties, while failing to muster the resources and morale for its wars across the sea. The siege lasted months. The people of Bordeaux were starving, and the British garrison was losing strength by the day. Finally, when French artillery began to make huge breaches in the city walls, it became clear that the end was inevitable. The British were forced to surrender. The fall of Bordeaux was not just the loss of a city. It was also the loss of the last vestige of England's power on the European continent. It was a great victory for France, but it also signaled the beginning of a new era in European politics. With the loss of Bordeaux, Britain's rule in France was completely over. With the exception of Calais, the British held no territory in France, and not for long. While for France, the final outcome of the 100 Years' War meant a united and restored nation, in England the losses triggered a deep internal reckoning. The protracted war had left England financially ruined, its people exhausted, and political turmoil brewing in the kingdom. This process set the stage for events such as the War of the Roses, which would soon erupt within Britain itself. But my friends, the real issue is not which side won at the end of the war, but the impact of these struggles on the peoples. The long war that ended with the fall of Bordeaux changed the structure of Europe, opened the door to the rise of nations and the beginning of a new era. The post-war period was shaped by the shadow of greater reckoning. But what awaited France after this great victory? And how would England return to the stage of history after this heavy defeat? Ah, my friends, in the next chapter we will explore together the dawn of this new era. Footballs are played behind us. Ah, my dear friends, the end of every great war heralds a new beginning, and the 100 Years' War was no exception. 100 years of conflict that changed forever the fate not only of France and England, but of the whole of Europe. It left behind not only devastated lands and lost lives, but also a lasting mark on the psyche of nations and the course of their history. I will now tell you the story of the new world that took shape in the aftermath of this great conflict. France underwent a profound transformation after this long struggle that ended in victory. Charles VII and his successors had learned to hold their kingdom together during the war. Strengthening central authority was not only a strategy, but a necessity. It was a long and arduous process to bring under control the nobles who had acted semi-independently in different parts of France after the English withdrawal. However, at the end of this process, a strong centralized monarchy would emerge. As the king's authority consolidated, the people as a whole became more loyal to their king. Over time, this national spirit inspired by Joan of Arc evolved into a national identity that formed the basis of the modern state in France. For England, however, the outcome of this war began a different story. The loss of most of the territory in France had weakened the English nobility and the crown economically and politically. This weakness further fueled rivalries within the royal family. Only a few years after the fall of Bordeaux, internal strife broke out in England, known as the Wars of the Roses. This power struggle between the Lancastrian and York dynasties would prevent England from maintaining peace for many years, even at home. While the civil wars plunged England into political turmoil, they also raised questions among the English people about who they were. Although they had lost territory to France, they began to gain an identity as an island kingdom. Perhaps it was these losses that made Britain set its sights far away, on the horizons of the New World. The waves of the war were felt not only in France and England, but throughout Europe. The collapse of the feudal system and the rise of national states was one of the most important legacies of this period. In a world previously dominated by local lords and nobles, people now looked to kings and centralized authorities. The post-war recovery of France and Britain inspired other parts of Europe. Thus, the first seeds of modern nation-states were sown. The traces left by this great war in every field, from agriculture to trade, from art to science, were just as impressive. The advanced artillery technologies and tactics used during the Hundred Years' War revolutionized the military world. The modernization of armies and the replacement of local militias by professional soldiers on the battlefields were innovations that changed the future of warfare. Now wars shaped not only the fate of nobles, but also the fate of peoples. Dear friends, at the end of every war, people ask each other the question, was it worth the suffering? The 100 Years' War, of course, brought many innocents into the ring of fire. But this long and grueling conflict also paved the way for the birth of modern Europe. Whatever it meant to people at the time, we can look back today and see the profound lessons these events have left for us. And then what happened? While Europe was trying to establish this new order, who in other lands pursued what dreams? What epics were written in the Far East or during the discovery of the New World? Here, my dear friends, we will continue to explore this world together, not from a history book, but as if it were a lived story. Now close your eyes for a moment, take a deep breath, and think about this. What futures might all these things that happened in the past be preparing us for? Hope to meet again in the next story.